Jesse has already mentioned about regulatory issues. So we have so far global agreements like Kyoto Protocol and hopefully the next agreement in this issue. We have also so far European regulations coming from European Strategy for Energy from 2007, the plan for energy technologies, and then legal framework for CO2 transport and storage mainly. This regulation shall be transposed to national legal systems in 2 years, which means mid-2011. Polish Ministry of Environment is now just working on preparing assumptions for Polish legislation in this field. And it's going to be approved finally in the end of the next year, and then it will be passed to Polish Parliament. So the schedule is to be on time with implementation that into Polish system. On the other hand, you mentioned about Norwegian origins. So, as from practical point of view, could you advise, or could you share the opinion? What is disturbing to the companies so far in implementation of CCS technologies from the regulatory point of view? We can tell that for the colleagues, especially in Germany, legal system doesn't allow fully for implementation of those technologies. So if you comment it would be great.
Should I start again? Okay. First of all, one of or the main issue why this is not implemented is not necessarily a regulatory or legal one, but is the pure fact that there is no incentive for separate industrial companies to use or implement the technology. It's very costly. Transportation, capture, and storage is, or the cost concern or regarded that is very much higher than the cost of emission. In many countries, it's more or less free to emit CO2 today. And why should company A invest heavily in a technology that will lead to distortion of competition? So it is not the regulation, but the lack of regulations that is a problem. And although the industry normally do not ask for taxes, levies, duties, or whatever you call it, in fact, the top of Statoil Hydro recently said at the conference that what we need is a higher price on CO2 emission. And that will be a basis for making CCS an important tool in combating climate change. Of course, we do have quite a lot of regulatory issues too. We do not have a firm regulatory regime for storage of CO2. I think the important thing with regard to storage is a very thorough preparation and site selection procedure that is approved at least regionally and preferably globally. Because then we have a framework, and that is also a basis for being able to gain public support, I think. We need a system that is transparent, that is acceptable with regard to storage as such. We do have, in fact, regulations that prohibit transport of CO2 cross boundaries, because as it is today, we can't take CO2 from Poland, for instance, to Norway due to regulations in the London Convention. So there are also a few issues which prohibit international trade or transport of CO2. But I think it's very difficult to sit in an office and make all the regulations that are needed. We will learn as we are going on, but we need some basic regulations with regard to especially storage, but also emission and transportation, or capture and transportation. and we do need a higher CO2 price as such. I think that will be a very good basis for succeeding. And I do think, as it is today, very few, if any, really mean that we could reach the targets for CO2 emission limitations without implementing CCS, because there are no real alternatives. Thanks.
So Kai is absolutely right that we need a higher price for CO2. Now, why do we need that? Because that will serve as an incentive for companies to invest in very expensive carbon capture and storage technology. And what is expensive? Well, one plant has a price of approximately 500 million euro. The Bekhlatov, I think, has a price tag of 1.2 billion I've seen. So this is a very expensive technology today, before we have validated it and before we had done introduced economy of scale. But if we translate this into the cost of capturing 1 ton, which was mentioned here earlier, that price is approximately 60 to 90 euro today to capture 1 ton of CO2. And as Pavel mentioned in the opening session, the current price of CO2 that you have to pay in order to emit is about 15 to 18 euro. So there's a great mismatch here. The European Union has made a huge bet. Okay? Their bet is that by 2020, the price of emitting carbon will be much higher than the price you have to pay to capture it. So that is the grand plan. From an environmental perspective, from Jesse and me, who believe that CCS is one element in a comprehensive way of dealing with climate change, we believe that is too risky. So we actually believe that the government should be given, or should give the companies a much clearer indication of when they should introduce CCS. And we call that an emission performance standard. It's something that has already been introduced in California, which is not, hardly has any coal, but it has gas-fired power plants. It means that when you produce 1 megawatt of electricity, you can only emit a certain amount of CO2. In California, it's 500. That will be unfair for coal, because it would only require CCS on coal-fired power plants and not on gas. But now this EPS standard has spread to Oregon and to Montana and to other much more coal-intensive states in the United States. We believe that is the option that Europe should choose as well. So the discussion is, when should this emission performance standard be introduced, and in which year, and at which level? Should we discriminate between coal and gas? Should we set it at 150 or 250 grams CO2 per kilowatt hour produced? Should we phase it in terms of first being relevant for new power plants and a later date for existing plants? This is the kind of debate that I believe that the European Commission, in its new mandate, as well as the European Parliament with your Polish President Jerzy Buzek, who is the champion of CCS, I believe they will start to think in these terms, because we cannot trust the market here. We cannot. Kai-Lima is absolutely right. We need a higher price, but the market signals will be insufficient to kickstart this very expensive technology today. So draw a clear line in the sand. And before I give the microphone to Jesse, the legal question. So there is one huge German utility, I shall not name the company, but who have always said that we cannot do CCS before we have the legal framework in place.